Welcome to SkyeTeam's People First with Morag Barrett.
Welcome to this week's episode of People First, and I am truly excited and honoured to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Jennifer McCollum. Jennifer most recently has been the CEO of Linkage, and if you haven't heard of Linkage, Linkage is a phenomenal organisation that provides leadership development support to businesses and leaders around the world. And most recently became part of SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. Jennifer, as CEO, oversaw the strategic direction and global operations of the leadership development firm with the mission to change the face of leadership. Linkage has dedicated more than 35 years to advancing women and accelerating inclusion in leaders and organizations. Linkage has been consistently ranked a top 20 training company, providing assessments, training, coaching, consulting, and conferences. But what I'm really excited to share with you, and you can see the poster behind Jennifer there, is the insights from her own career journey and research from Linkage for her new book. And it's called In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO, Overcoming the Hurdles to Change the Face of Leadership. Jennifer, welcome to People First.
Thank you so much, Morag. It's always a little humbling to hear someone else talk about you. So thank you so much.
Well, it's all well deserved. I have admired you and the work that you've done. And in every conversation that we've had, there's invariably something and more that I take away. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with our viewers and our listeners on People First. But they know this, you don't. I start every episode with the origin story. So when you were a wee girl, you're in elementary school, middle school, or whatever, the teacher says, Jennifer, pay attention. What do you want to be when you grow up? What was your answer back then?
So I grew up in Europe, and I moved to the United States for the first time. And so wee girl, I'm going to take it a little bit further. I moved to the US for the first time when I was in middle school, so 12, 13 years old. Note to any aspiring parents out there, do not ever do that. And by the time I got to college, I knew I was a little bit different. You know, I was a citizen of the world, a global perspective. I was not very cool in those middle school and high school days, but I found my confidence as I got into college. And my biggest aspiration as I went through college was to be on the Today Show as the host of the newscaster, the host of the Today Show.
Well, it's interesting. So I flash back now, as I was growing up, kids' TV was 3 till 5 or 3 till 6 every afternoon. And we had the 3 channels, you know, and we lived in a shoebox and it was uphill both ways, you know, those sort of lamentable stories. But I too wanted to be a TV presenter, but on kids' TV. So what was the pivot point then that took you from wanting to be on the Today Show to the career path you ended up following?
So in college, I did multiple internships at television stations and radio stations. And you start to learn the reality of, wow, this is really hard. You need to go live in this teeny tiny market in the middle of, Omaha, Nebraska, and get up at 4 in the morning. And I wasn't really sure I wanted to pursue that path, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I had no money, and I thought, I need to do more schooling to really get a better sense. So I would give people different advice today, but I jumped right into my master's degree because it was fully funded, and I went to Scotland. I went to Stirling, Scotland. The Rotary International Organization funded my scholarship for my master's degree. And that master's degree was the other side of the news media. It was in public relations and corporate affairs. So I write about this in the book. Actually, my first foray into the corporate world was as an intern for the Coca-Cola company in their media relations department for, get this, their worldwide sports properties. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time, but it was the Olympic Games and the World Cup. It was the most amazing job on the other side of the news media. It was influencing the news media.
All right, so we're going to fast forward from TV presenter to working in your internship to this book, which I couldn't put down. It's amazing. So In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO and Overcoming Hurdles to the Challenge of Leadership. or to change the face of leadership. We'll talk more about those hurdles in a moment. But why this book? Why now?
So I have never done this before, Morag, but I'm going to attempt to weave how we started to where we ended in about 30 seconds. And
Do it then.
when I was the entire time I was in the public relations business, and it was across the course of about my first 6 years of my career, including 5 of those years at the Coca-Cola Company, I kept thinking, if I could get in front of the camera, if I could lead the teams. Our job in public relations was to lift everybody else up. And at the time in the 90s and into the 2000s, mostly lifting those up meant white corporate male executives. They were really, by and large, back then, kind of 90+% of the executives in power. We've made a little bit of progress since then. But that was the beginning of me really wanting to move in front of the camera, to be a leader, to lead teams, to lead businesses. But it was slowly over time at the Coca-Cola Company that I also realized I wanted to be a leader in the leadership space. So helping leaders and teams and organizations fulfill their purpose. So fast forward to your question. Through the twists and turns of the next 20, 25 years, I have made my life's work around supporting leaders and teams and organizations fulfill their potential. At Linkage, as you so beautifully started, our mission is to change the face of leadership. So we were focused, a lot of our business is focused on how to accelerate gender equity, how to advance women, how to create cultures of inclusion where everybody can thrive. This book is the latest chapter of a story that we at Linkage knew had to be told. There was new data, there was new insight, new perspective on what it was going to take to drive gender equity in leadership.
All right. So one of the things that really pushes my buttons right now is, well, in general, that's not even just right now. It pushed my buttons last year. It pushed my buttons 30 years ago when I started out in my career. The data is there that there isn't diversity and inclusion by any measures at senior leadership levels. We don't need to prove it anymore. We can see it. And the latest research I was reading, that it's going to take 100 years. This is where my blood boils. 100 years to get to equity, and I call BS on that. Why is it, do you think, that those systematic issues and blinding gaps still exist?
Yeah. Well, the one thing, so you're absolutely right. By every measure, it's very easy to see the diversity numbers, and you are. I think you said I'm calling BS because those numbers are low. The World Economic Forum would say that it's closer to 136 years. But yes, regardless, more than our lifetime that has, right?
That's the BS. It shouldn't take 136 years to fix it. No.
I hear you. But here's what you didn't say, and this is also really well documented, which is the business case for change is so well researched about any measure of diversity, but let's just take gender diversity since that's the focus of the book. And by the way, we believe that by focusing on gender diversity, it helps all underrepresented populations rise, because women are the largest underrepresented population. We're half the workforce, but only less than 28 or so percent of the leadership positions. Okay, so with the business case so clear and the numbers so obvious, why aren't things moving faster? I stopped talking about the data and the business case and the research quite a while ago, and it's when I had a conversation with one of my heroes, actually. Her name is Dr. Tanya Matthews, and she's the CEO of the African American Museum that just opened about a year ago in Charleston. And she said, Jennifer, if it were all about the numbers, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. The case for change has to be stronger, more compelling, not only from the head, but also from the heart, emotionally compelling for the status quo. So this is where I get really passionate about the role of men in helping solve this problem.
So say more about that then.
Yeah. So we at Linkage do an awful lot of work in helping, we call it executive sponsorship, again, by and large, because of the numbers. 70+% of the people who come through our executive sponsorship work are men, and most of them are white men. And I fundamentally believe that by and large, these 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 men, people in power, aren't bad, toxic. That they're not opposed to doing the right thing. They don't understand the clear role they play. They don't understand why solving this will actually benefit them too. And I get really irritated when we say, let's just start with the men who have daughters, because clearly they want to see a world better for their daughters. Then I would say men who have only sons, it's equally important for them. And so we've got to wrap our arms around them and help them see, what does good look like and what's in it for you.
So I like the way that you're framing it, because this isn't just a women's issue. This isn't just about us as women adjusting how we show up to fit into a historic mindset of what does it take to be a successful leader. It is looking at fixing this challenge or closing the gap from all lenses.
That's right. I'm actually really glad you didn't say it exactly this way. So I'm going to tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth. This is no longer about, hey, let's make sure women fit in to the status quo so that they assimilate to look and sound and act more like men. And I would say that as we grew up in leadership, Morag, that probably was more of what we were taught in the 90s, in the 2000s.
Oh, yes.
Put on those shoulder pads. Let's dress like a man. Let's have executive presence. And so we often call that, assimilating to the status quo. And more, especially in the post-pandemic world, and I write about this quite a bit, there's an entire chapter on what we call branding and presence. And it is important for all of us, but specifically for women, it's important that we understand how we show up and compare it to the intention that we have in terms of how we want to show up. It's not about showing up to look and act like the status quo. And so these words like authenticity and vulnerability and transparency, words that you wouldn't have used to describe the most effective leaders in a pre-pandemic world, those are words that we describe effective leaders now. And guess what? Women, through our research and data, really spike in what we call the evolving expectations of leadership.
So let's just start there, because I know you've got the 8 hurdles that we're going to talk about, but branding and presence being one of them. So, okay, so I hear this, I see it on LinkedIn, social media, branding, personal branding. Where do I start? How do I find out, A, what others perceive of me, but also how do I even start to articulate what is important for me and the brand I want to shape and present?
Ooh, you're actually bringing 2 hurdles into bear. So I think I actually might take a step back. The hurdles are unveiled in the book, in our research and our assessments, in order. It's circular, of course, but a hurdle that precedes branding and presence is called the hurdle of clarity. And the hurdle of clarity answers, if I were to ask you, what is it you want to achieve, and we'll just take professionally for now, professionally across the next couple years, could you answer that question? And part of that question is around, and what kind of, person, professional, leader, expert, you fill in the blank, would it require for you to achieve that aspiration? Now, when I ask women the question about what is it that you want at a specific point in time in the future, this is what I usually get back. I don't know. I've never thought about it. Nobody's asked me that. Or I'm so busy at work and at home and in my multiple shifts that I play. I don't possibly have time to think about it. Or my least favorite one is, I'm afraid to actually articulate it, because if I put it out in the world and it doesn't happen, then it's worse than having articulated it at all. So overcoming the hurdle of clarity actually helps lead to branding and presence. What type of person or leader do you most aspire to be? And if I were to text 5 of the people closest to me professionally, you could do it personally as well, and say, like, what are the 3, 4, 5 words that spring to mind when you think about
Mhm.
me operating professionally, you want to compare those words to the words that you would put out there and see what kind of
Mhm.
connection or disconnection. And look, you and I have done a lot of coaching in the world. Feedback, especially 360 feedback that, people who care about you, or maybe even the ones that don't,
Mhm.
how would they describe you?
I love that, and it sounds deceptively simple. What are the 3 words to describe me at my best, 3 words that describe me at my worst or not best, and then understand the gap, because then you have the opportunity to make a choice as to where do I need to turn the dial up or down. One of the early chapters, though, you talk about is around internal bias, and we've got the road of the inner critic, etc. To say more about what that is and how that acts as a hurdle for leaders.
And again, I'll pair the inner critic with internal bias. So the inner critic is that very pesky and loud voice in our head that can prevent us from taking action and following our dreams. Oftentimes, most times, the voice is very critical. It could be pointed at ourselves, and typically it is when, as we're rising in our career. It also can be pointed at others. It's that voice of judgment. And so I tell the story in the book about how the inner critic often shows up for women, and it could sound like, um, I'm not worth it. I shouldn't ask for that raise or that
Mm.
promotion. Um, I shouldn't speak up. People wouldn't value what I have to say anyway. So that's kind of the voice sounds like when it's pointed at ourselves. Again, equally, you could point it at others and say, he should know that by now. Why did she take action on that? So that judgment voice. Now, the inner critic that speaks to us all day long can be quieted. For women, it's louder. And like I said, it prevents us from taking action. I actually tell the story about 5, 6 years ago when I was asked to consider the CEO ship of Linkage, and the headhunter came to me, and my voice in my head was so loud, it almost prevented me from putting my name in the ring altogether, my hat in the ring,
Mhm.
because it sounded like, um, you're not ready to be a CEO. You have to be a number two first. You haven't
Mhm.
managed the P&L all the way down to the net income line. What kind of mother will you be? You've got 3 children and you're going to be taking a job that requires you to commute. So that nonstop talk. Okay. So, how does that relate to internal bias? Now, let me just pause there. Does that inner critic resonate with you?
Oh, good grief. Yes, I wish she would shut up. And I'm getting better at turning the volume down, but that whole I'm not ready, you can't because they won't, it can be exhausting. Exhausting.
Yeah, and and interestingly, as I give keynotes around the world, while it is louder for women, I have many men come up to me and say, "Well, I have an inner critic too. It's just that we have to suppress it and we can't talk about it." So I think there's some
Mhm.
interesting research to be done, not only other underrepresented populations like men of color, but what about white men in the majority? Do they have these very hurdles too? They just have to pretend, or society? All right, so let's talk about society as we go to internal bias.
Mhm.
External bias has been very well studied, and there's a lot of external bias out there that we need to work on systemically in our organizations. So, pay equity is a great example of that. Um, Similarity bias, we all tend to hire and promote and support people who look like us.
Mhm.
The internal bias is not any of that. Internal bias is how we've taken our life experience with all of the external biases that exist and how we've pulled those in and formulated beliefs that may not be serving us. So for me, I had
Mm.
to grapple with a couple biases when I took the linkage job. One bias sounded like, you can't be a good mom with a CEO job. Now, I had to kind of hold that up and question, is that belief true? Is it serving me? If I were to ask my children themselves what they think about me taking the job, what actually happened was I was holding the belief, but they weren't. So that's an
Mhm.
example of really another bias that women tend to have is, it's just done better when I do it all myself. And that bias
Okay.
that bias leads to a lot of what we call over rowing the boat, which is another hurdle called proving your value. So let me just pause there for a moment. We identify the hurdles. We talk about why they're hurdles for women, but really critically, we want a roadmap and a support, actionable guidance to help you overcome them.
Are hurdles for life or are they situational? Do I get over them and then that's it, cured, done?
So the hurdles, the way I like to talk about it is most of the time hurdles never go away completely. But our job as we become more self aware and practiced in overcoming them is to make the hurdles lower and lower. And for something like the inner
Mm.
critic, which is that, we call that the Uber, the overarching hurdle that weaves its way through all the other ones, that one, um, the challenge is to become aware and identify them, take action around them so they become lower and you become much faster at getting over them. So inner critic, we'll just go back to it. If you can become aware of that voice and pause and get a lot more compassionate with yourself. I mean, the reason I was questioning whether I was a worthy CEO is because I was scared. I had
Yeah.
never, I'd had big jobs before under the umbrella of publicly traded companies. This felt very different to me in a private equity backed company. Same skills, same level of challenge that I had experienced before. It's just the fear crept in. And once I got clear about that, I could quiet that inner critic a little bit faster.
So one of the chapters is dedicated to networking. And as you know, relationships are near and dear to my heart and our books. And so what role have relationships played in your success, especially in bringing the book to life?
Oh, well, you have been a part of that, Morag, and I will be forever grateful for the network that we share together with the 100 coaches. Interestingly, networking is one of those things I have completely changed my perspective on as from a young professional to a mature, I'll call ourselves mature professionals. And I would say I spend more time really focused on networking. And then the corollary is the next, or the preceding hurdle, which is called making the ask. So it's not that women aren't exceptional at what I call curating a network. We're actually very, again, stereotyping, but by and large, very relationally oriented and very willing to give generously to the network. What's much harder for women is what I call activating the network, getting really clear about which parts of your network do you need right now, and how can you
Mhm.
actually make the ask of that network. And then people say, oh, well, giving to the network is equally important. And I say, absolutely. Women don't have that problem by and large.
Mhm.
So back
So
to the book. You asked the most
yeah,
important the
exactly.
question about the book. It was I think I underestimated how important it was for me to surround myself. I'd never written a book before, so you were actually a big step ahead of me. So watching you, seeking advice from you and many others in the writing process, the editing process, the promotional process, getting really humble to say, I need help. And
Mhm.
the book was an 18-month experiment in how to really leverage a network and to make asks of that network, and hopefully I have a chance to offer in return the same.
Thank you. So I'm sure people have asked, when's the next one coming out?
So it's funny, as soon as the book came out, my agent said, so the next one, you're going to start writing the next one right away. And I don't know how you feel. For me, the book has to whisper to me. And this was my first
Mhm.
experience, and I had been meaning to write a book for well over a decade. It was when I had a sense of what I had to say, how it would contribute in the leadership space, which pieces were going to be mine versus others versus linkage data. And it all came together across a lot of work. And so I'm going to have to decide if when I'm ready and willing to do that again.
So as you think about 2024 then, what's your one hope, not just for the women who are aspiring to senior leadership or looking to grow their leadership brand, but for leaders of all flavors? What is your hope that 2024 brings for those leaders?
So I think it's a beautiful place to land here, one of where we started, which is um, the world has a lot of problems that we need to solve, not only in our organizations, but in our society. We know that the evolution of the workforce is such that the opportunities and the problems cannot be solved with only the existing leadership at the top today. It's going to take all of us, just even to fill the roles that we have in the complexity that we live in. So my hope is that through this book, any woman who aspires to advance in her career, and every leader, man or woman at any and the entire spectrum in between, at any level, who aspires to support her, to support the women, will come together leveraging this book as as a as a roadmap for how we can accelerate the rise of all underrepresented leaders faster, so that we can impact our organizations better.
Thank you. So, Jennifer, I appreciate your time today with me on People First. Thank you. I recommend everybody to get your own copy, whether it's the digital audio or the hard copy of In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO. You will not be disappointed, and I wish you every ongoing success and happiness throughout the year and beyond.
Thank you so much, Morag. It is such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining Morag today. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe so you don't miss a thing. If you learned something worth sharing, share it. Cultivate your relationships today when you don't need anything before you need something. Be sure to follow SkyeTeam and Morag on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any ideas about topics we should tackle, interviews we should do, or if you yourself would like to be on the show, drop us a line at info@skyeteam.com. That's SKYE team.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and remember, business is personal and relationships matter. We are your allies.